Hey guys, hope you're all doing great. Today, I've got an original story for you. One you've never heard before because I just wrote it. I made it as interesting as possible, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's get into it. The smell of roasted garlic and butter filled the house, rich and warm, carrying from the kitchen to the open living room where the soft murmur of a TV played in the background. The windows were fogged from the heat of the stove, the golden glow of the overhead lights making everything feel safe, familiar. It was always like this when Robert came home. A full month at sea, then back to his family, the same rhythm they had followed for years. In the kitchen, Emma moved with practiced ease, stirring a pot of sauce, checking the roast in the oven. She always cooked something special on his first night home. Tonight, it was his favorite: beef tenderloin, mashed potatoes, sautéed green beans. She never asked if he was hungry after a flight back. She just made sure there was a hot meal waiting, like always. The girls were upstairs, likely on their phones or finishing homework. They had stopped running to the door when he came home a few years ago, but they still waited. Their world kept turning when he was away, but he liked to believe his return still meant something. Robert dropped his bag by the door, rolling the stiffness out of his shoulders. The scent of home wrapped around him: fabric softener, a faint trace of Emma's vanilla-scented candle, and the crisp, clean air that wasn't thick with salt and diesel fumes. "Smells amazing," he said, stepping into the kitchen. Emma turned, smiling. "Welcome home." She came to him, pressing a hand against his chest before leaning in for a kiss. A real one, not the absent-minded peck she gave when he called from offshore. He rested a hand on the small of her back, breathing her in, letting himself settle into the life he worked so hard to give them. "Long flight?" she asked. "Same as always. Worth it to be home," she smiled, turning back to the stove. "Girls are upstairs. You should call them down." Robert nodded, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "Yeah, I'll get them." But before he could move, he let himself sink into the moment, the warmth, the normalcy. This was what he worked for: the house, the comfort, the security. Robert had spent most of his adult life on offshore oil platforms. As a chief engineer, he wasn't just responsible for machinery. He kept the whole operation running. Every pump, every generator, every engine relied on his expertise. When things failed, he was the one who made sure they didn't stay broken. A bad system failure offshore wasn't just an inconvenience. It could mean millions in lost revenue, or worse, lives at risk. He worked on a 28 and 28 rotation, 28 days offshore, then 28 at home. Sometimes he took extra contracts, flying out to other platforms, supervising builds, inspecting new rigs. It paid better than any job he could have taken on land. The money was the trade-off for missing birthdays, anniversaries, first days of school, and it paid well. They had a beautiful home in North Carolina, nestled in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets. It wasn't a mansion, but it was big: a 4-bedroom colonial with a sprawling backyard, space for the girls to grow up comfortably. They drove new cars. Emma had a luxury SUV, perfect for road trips and school drop-offs. Robert kept a black Ford truck, built tough, something solid to come back to. Holidays? They never missed out. When he was home, they took trips. Skiing in Colorado, summers in the Caribbean, a week in Italy last spring. He made up for his absences with experiences, with memories. His daughters never worried about tuition. Their college funds were fully covered. They wore nice clothes, had the latest phones, never had to stress over what they could or couldn't afford. On the surface, it was the perfect life. But there was a trade-off. Robert had spent years convincing himself that providing was enough, that the price of being away so often was worth the life he was building for them. He told himself they understood. That Emma understood, that his daughters, now in their last year of high school, would look back one day and see all the sacrifices he made and be grateful. As long as he came back, this would always be his home. He glanced at Emma as she moved around the kitchen, the soft clatter of plates filling the space. It felt good to be here again, to sink back into this world of warmth and routine. He wanted to believe it was the same as always, that he could pick up where he left off. "Go call the girls," Emma said, glancing at him over her shoulder. "They've been upstairs too long." Robert exhaled, nodding. "I'll get them." He stepped out of the kitchen, moving toward the stairs. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness that came before dinner when everything was settled and waiting. He took the steps slowly, the worn wood familiar beneath his feet. At the top of the stairs, he turned toward Sophie's room. The door was almost closed, light spilling from the gap at the bottom. He lifted a hand to knock. Then he heard their voices, muffled at first, then clearer as he stepped closer. "I just wish she'd stop lying," Stacy's voice, sharp, frustrated. Robert frowned. "She's not lying," Sophie shot back. "She's just waiting for the right time." "The right time?" Stacy let out a bitter laugh. "You mean when Dad finally gets a clue? When he walks in and catches her? Or when Dan finally decides he's tired of sneaking around?" Robert's fingers curled slightly at his sides. "You don't get it," Sophie snapped. "Mom's happy with him. You think she's happy when Dad's home? She's exhausted. She's pretending. He barely even exists to her anymore." Stacy's voice dropped, colder now. Maybe because she's already moved on while still wearing his last name. Silence. Then Sophie exhaled sharply. "You're acting like she's the bad guy, like she's cheating on some amazing husband who's always here, always taking care of her. Dad's never home, Stacy. He's a guest in his own house." "That's not his fault," Stacy hissed. "He works his ass off for us, for this house, for everything we have. What do you think paid for your car, your college? Do you think Dan is going to do that?" Sophie scoffed. "Dan's already done more for us than Dad has in years." Robert felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Stacy's voice turned sharp. "Oh, I get it. You protect him because he buys you gifts, because he fixed your car." Sophie's silence lasted just a second too long. "So what?" she finally said, defensive. "At least he cares." Stacy let out a disgusted laugh. "Yeah, of course he does. He's buying you off." Sophie's voice sharpened. "You just don't want to admit Mom's already moved on. You're holding on to some fairy tale." Stacy's voice was tight. "You're disgusting." Sophie's tone was ice. "And you're in denial." The air between them was thick. Then Stacy spoke again, quieter but laced with anger. "Does Grandma know?" Sophie hesitated. "Yeah." Robert's breath caught. "I saw them at her house last month," Sophie continued. "Mom was sitting on his lap. Grandma walked in and she just didn't say anything. She saw it, and she let it happen." Stacy sucked in a breath. "So the only ones left in the dark are Grandpa and Dad." The words sliced through him. Robert felt the ground shift beneath him, the warmth of the house suddenly suffocating. He had convinced himself that coming back was enough, that money, stability, vacations, college funds, all of it meant something. But standing in that hallway, hearing his daughters argue about whether his wife should just rip off the bandage and leave him, he realized he had already lost them. He stepped away, forcing himself to move soundlessly back down the stairs. Dinner was waiting. So was the truth. Robert stood frozen in the hallway, his pulse thudding in his ears. The warmth of the house, the smell of garlic and butter, the soft hum of the TV downstairs, the golden glow of the lights, felt foreign now, like a set piece in a play he hadn't realized he wasn't part of anymore. His daughters' voices still echoed in his head. The words replayed over and over, like a hammer driving nails into something already fragile. "Mom's already made her choice. Dan's already done more for us than Dad has in years. Grandma walked in and she just didn't say anything. So the only ones left in the dark are Grandpa and Dad." His stomach clenched, the weight of their casual betrayal sinking deep. They had all known. His wife, his daughters, even his mother. They had all watched his life unravel in silence, waiting for him to figure it out on his own. He inhaled sharply, forcing himself to breathe. His first instinct was to storm inside that room, demand an explanation, make them look him in the eye and say those things to his face. But what good would that do? They had already decided he didn't belong. He turned away from the door, his steps slow, heavy, moving on autopilot as he made his way back down the stairs. His mind was still stuck on the name that burned through the conversation. Dan, of all people. He reached the bottom of the stairs, gripping the railing as the memories came flooding back. Dan had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. His stepbrother, his cousin, the boy his parents had taken in when no one else would. Robert had been 10 when Dan came to live with them. A scared 5-year-old with wild blonde hair, skinny arms, and hollow eyes. He barely spoke at first, just followed Robert around the house like a shadow. Dan's mother, Robert's aunt, had been a junkie, living in a rundown trailer park outside the city. She had overdosed on heroin in the bathroom of a gas station. His father, some nameless addict who disappeared long before Dan could remember his face. Robert's parents had stepped in, taken Dan in as their own. They never said it outright, but there was always guilt in the way they treated him. Like they were making up for the life he could have had, like they were trying to erase the stain of his mother's failures. And Robert had never questioned it. Dan was his little brother. They played together, fought like brothers do, built forts in the backyard, rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. But then life happened. Robert left for college at 18, studying mechanical engineering at a state school. Not a fancy university, but his parents had poured every cent they had into making sure he got a proper education. They didn't want him to struggle. They wanted him to have a real career, something stable, something better than what they had. Dan got what was left. By the time Robert had graduated and started working offshore, Dan was stuck at a local community college studying auto repair. He wasn't dumb, far from it, but he didn't have options. There was no money left for him to go anywhere else. Robert knew his parents felt guilty about it. They never said it outright, but it was obvious. Dan got a used car while Robert got tuition. Dan worked part-time while Robert studied full-time. Dan stayed behind while Robert went off to build a future. And even though Dan never complained, Robert knew it ate at him. His parents tried to make up for it in little ways, helping Dan buy tools, letting him stay at home rent-free while he got on his feet. But it wasn't the same. Robert had always trusted Dan. Dan had been the one person he never questioned. He had been there for Emma and the girls when Robert was away, fixing things around the house, driving them to appointments, helping with whatever they needed. Robert had never suspected anything was wrong. Why would he? Dan was family. When Dan struggled with work, when money got tight, Robert had stepped in like a big brother should. He had lent him $20,000 to start his own business, some kind of auto shop. It never happened. The business failed before it even got off the ground, and Dan lost the money. Robert never expected him to pay it back. He told himself it was fine, that Dan made up for it in other ways. He was always around, always helping, always there. But now, as Robert sat in the living room, hands clenched into fists, he realized the truth. Dan hadn't been helping, Dan had been taking, and Robert had let him, because he trusted him, because he had never, not even once, seen Dan as a threat. And now, Dan had taken everything. His place in the house, his place in his daughter's lives, his wife. And one question kept scratching at the back of his mind, a thought he had ignored for years. Why didn't Dan ever have a family of his own? Dan was good-looking, charismatic. Women liked him. He was funny, easy to talk to, the kind of guy who always knew how to get on someone's good side. So why had he never settled down? Why had he never had a serious girlfriend? Why was he always just there? Was it because he didn't want the responsibility? Or because he had never needed to? Had Dan been circling Emma for years, waiting for an opening? Or was it something else? There had been times Robert had wondered, just in passing, was Dan even into women? Not that it mattered. Not in a way Robert cared about. But it had crossed his mind a few times late at night when he thought about the fact that Dan had never introduced a girlfriend, never brought anyone home, never even mentioned a serious relationship. Had he just never noticed what was right in front of him? Or had Dan been playing the long game all along? Robert clenched his jaw, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had been so focused on providing that he hadn't realized he was being replaced. And now, he had no idea what the hell he was supposed to do next. Robert walked downstairs, his mind still spinning, his body moving on autopilot. He had forgotten why he even went up there in the first place. He reached the kitchen, barely aware of the clinking dishes and the sound of Emma adjusting the plates. "Robert?" Emma turned to look at him. "You didn't call the girls?" Robert blinked. He had completely forgotten. Before he could answer, Emma sighed, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I'll get them." She stepped away, calling up the stairs. "Girls, dinner!" The tension in his chest tightened. He wasn't ready to face them. The girls came down a minute later, Sophie first, calm as always, and Stacy stomping behind her, her phone clenched in one hand, already pissed off at something. Stacy dropped into her chair with dramatic force, crossing her arms like the whole world had wronged her. "Took you long enough to get home," she muttered. Robert tensed. "What?" "You're always gone," she snapped, looking up at him now. Her eyes were already glassy, emotion boiling just under the surface. "And now you're just sitting there staring at the wall like you don't even want to be here." Emma let out a soft sigh. "Stacy, don't start." "No, I'm serious," Stacy's voice cracked. "He's never here. He works and works and..." What for? What's the point if you're never home? Sophie, sitting beside her, stiffened. That's not fair. Stacy shot her a glare. Oh, please, you always take his side. Because he works his ass off for us. Sophie fired back. Do you think this house pays for itself? Your car? Your stupid shopping trips? Stacy turned back to Robert, furious tears in her eyes. I wish I had a different father. The words hit him harder than he expected. The room fell silent. Even Emma froze for a second before quickly stepping in. Okay, that's enough. Everyone calm down. Stacy shoved her chair back, storming away from the table. Whatever, she muttered, disappearing down the hall. Robert stared at his plate, his stomach turning. Emma exhaled, rubbing her temples. Teenagers, it's hormones, Robert. She doesn't mean it, but she did. She meant every word. Sophie sat across from him, her face still flushed from arguing, her fingers clenched around her fork. She hesitated before speaking, softer now. Dad, she said. You know she doesn't hate you, right? Robert forced himself to nod. Yeah, he lied. Sophie didn't look convinced. The rest of the meal was silent. After dinner, Robert pretended to get a work call. He pulled out his phone, scrolled for a second, then sighed loudly. Emma raised an eyebrow. Everything okay? Robert frowned, pretending to read something urgent. I just got a work call. Something came up. Her frown deepened. But you just got home. I know, he said, shaking his head. They need me back for a couple of days. I have to fly out tonight. Emma sighed, clearly annoyed but not surprised. Well, that's annoying, but I guess it's not like you can say no. Stacy, from the living room, muttered, Of course not. Robert ignored her. I'll pack. Instead of the airport, Robert drove to a motel outside town. A cheap place, nothing special, but it was quiet. He needed time to think. The next morning, he made his first move. He called a lawyer. Robert sat stiffly in the leather chair, his hands clasped together, his jaw tight. Across from him, Ethan Mason leaned back, tapping his pen against a legal pad. The lawyer had the kind of face that had seen too many betrayals and wasn't surprised by much. All right, Ethan said, flipping open his notebook. Let's start with the basics. You think your wife's cheating? Robert exhaled. I know she is. Ethan raised an eyebrow. With your stepbrother? Robert nodded. Ethan let out a low whistle. That's brutal. He clicked his pen and leaned forward. All right, Robert, let's talk numbers. What are we dealing with? Robert rubbed his temple. I make $300,000 a year. Ethan nodded, jotting it down. Chief engineer offshore, right? Yeah. 28 days on, 28 off. It's been my schedule for years. Good salary, Ethan said. Next, biggest assets, house, paid off, worth about $850. Ethan's eyebrow lifted slightly. Nice. Savings? About $500,000. Retirement accounts? $750,000. College funds? 2 accounts, $100,000 each. Ethan scribbled quickly. All right. Vehicles? I drive a black Ford truck. Emma's got a luxury SUV, but it's under my name. Good, Ethan said. That means it's legally yours. If she wants to keep it, she has to give up something else. Robert nodded, feeling a small flicker of control creeping back in. Any debts? Ethan asked. Robert clenched his jaw. I lent Dan $20,000 to start a business. He never paid me back. Ethan's pen froze midair. You're kidding, he said. Nope, Robert muttered. I figured he'd pay me back when he got things going, but he never did. He barely even mentions it anymore. Ethan let out a sharp laugh. Let me guess, no contract? Robert sighed. No contract. Jesus, Ethan muttered. You're never seeing that money again. Figures, Robert muttered. Ethan flipped to a clean page. All right, here's where it gets tricky. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. That means a judge won't necessarily split things 50-50, but they'll try to make it fair. Robert's stomach twisted. She didn't earn any of it. Doesn't matter, Ethan said flatly. Legally, half of everything you earned during the marriage is considered marital property. Robert gritted his teeth. How do I stop her from taking half of what I worked for? Ethan leaned forward, his eyes sharp. You prove she cheated. Robert's brow furrowed. That actually changes things? Oh yeah, Ethan said. North Carolina still recognizes marital misconduct. If we prove she had an affair, she loses leverage for alimony, and it might even impact the asset division. Robert's mind switched into focus. How do I prove it? Evidence, Ethan said simply. Texts, emails, bank statements, hotel receipts, photos. Anything that directly proves infidelity. Suspicion isn't enough. You need proof. Robert nodded slowly. I can get that. Good. But even if you don't, we have other ways to make sure you don't get screwed. Robert leaned in. Like what? Ethan started listing off options. First, your retirement accounts. Start shifting more of your money into them. It's harder to divide assets that are tied up long term. Robert raised an eyebrow. That's legal, as long as you do it before the divorce is filed? Absolutely, Ethan said. Now let's talk the house. You want to keep it? Robert hesitated. Honestly, I don't know. Well, if she fights for half your savings, you push for full ownership of the house, Ethan explained. Use it as leverage. Robert considered that. And the cars? You keep the SUV since it's in your name. If she wants it, she can trade something for it. Robert smirked slightly. So basically, I make her work for everything. Exactly, Ethan said. Now let's talk about Dan. Robert tensed. What about him? Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. You know North Carolina still has alienation of affection laws, right? Robert frowned. Meaning? Meaning, Ethan said. You can sue Dan. Robert blinked. Wait, you're serious? Dead serious, Ethan said. If you can prove that Dan actively interfered in your marriage, you can file a lawsuit against him for damages. Robert exhaled, considering it. He's been in my house, Robert muttered. Helping my wife, driving my kids around. I lent him 20 grand and now he's sleeping with my wife. His voice darkened. Yeah, that feels like damage. Ethan smirked. Then we'll keep that option open. Robert's mind raced. So what do I do now? Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. You do nothing. You don't confront her. You don't say a word. You act normal. You gather proof, then we hit her with it. Robert exhaled, feeling the weight of the plan settle over him. How long does this process take? He asked. If she fights, Ethan said, could take a year or more. If she settles, a few months. But if we play this right, you'll come out ahead. Robert clenched his jaw. I want to make sure she regrets this, he said. Ethan's smile was cold. Then we do this the right way. Robert wasn't going home. Not yet. He was going to use this time like he was offshore, detached, distant, watching. For years, he had been blind to what was happening right in front of him. Now, he was going to see everything. And when the time came, Emma and Dan would regret every single choice they made. Robert sat in his motel room, staring at the small collection of surveillance tools he had gathered over the past 24 hours. The 2 GPS trackers lay next to his phone, already configured and ready to go. But the third device? That one was special. It was a tiny, voice-activated recorder, small enough to hide in the car without being noticed. It had a long battery life, capable of picking up conversations for days at a time. He didn't just want to know where Emma and Dan were going. He wanted to know what they were saying, what they thought, what they really felt, what they were planning. He needed to hear it from their own mouths. After midnight, Robert left the motel, driving his rented beat-up sedan through the familiar streets, keeping to the back roads. The darkness made it easier. Fewer people out, fewer chances of being seen. His first stop, Emma's SUV. He parked 2 streets away just in case. Walking toward the house, his heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sheer rage boiling beneath the surface. This wasn't just some recon mission. This was war. Emma's car was parked in its usual spot, the driveway, next to the garage. The neighborhood was quiet, no lights in the windows, no movement. Robert crouched beside the passenger side, reaching under the rear bumper. He pressed the GPS tracker firmly into place, making sure the magnet held. A quick glance at his phone. The blip appeared on the map. 1 down. Now, for the recorder. He moved carefully, opening the passenger side door just enough to slip inside. The car smelled like Emma's vanilla-scented air freshener. Too familiar. Too much like home. He pushed the thought away and focused. The best hiding spot? Underneath the seat. Robert peeled back the thin fabric that covered the seat's underside, finding the perfect crevice. He slid the voice recorder deep inside, securing it in place with its own adhesive. Hidden, invisible, ready. If Emma and Dan ever talked in this car, he'd hear it. He took a slow breath and stepped out, closing the door silently. Checking his phone, he activated the recorder remotely. It was live. Now, on to Dan. Dan's apartment was on the opposite side of town, a place Robert had barely visited over the years. Pulling up a block away, he scanned the street. Quiet, no movement. Dan's black Jeep Cherokee was parked right outside. Too easy. Robert approached, crouched beside the driver's side wheel well and secured the second GPS tracker. He pressed it hard against the metal, ensuring it wouldn't fall off. Another check. His phone beeped. The second blip appeared on the map. Now, he didn't just know where they were going. He would know what they were saying. Robert took one last glance at Dan's apartment. The lights were on inside, shadows moving past the curtains. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to walk away. Not yet. Soon. Very soon. The next evening, Robert's phone buzzed. The two GPS signals had merged, Dan and Emma, together at a restaurant. Robert grabbed his keys, slid into his rented beat-up sedan, and started the chase. He parked across the street, blending into the shadows. His fingers tapped idly against the steering wheel as he stared at the cozy little Italian restaurant, its warm golden glow spilling onto the sidewalk. Inside, behind those glass panes, Emma and Dan were having the time of their lives. His stomach twisted at the sight of them sitting at a candlelit table, leaning in close, smiling, laughing, drinking wine, his fingers curled around the steering wheel, knuckles white. That should be me. His mind spun through scenarios, his body itching to move. He imagined getting out of the car, walking straight into that restaurant, gripping Dan by the collar, and slamming his face into the table. He could practically hear the plates shattering, the gasps of the other diners, the wet crunch of Dan's nose breaking against the edge of a ceramic plate. Or maybe he'd drag him outside, throw him against the pavement, slam his head against the hood of the car. Make him beg, make him feel small, make him feel as helpless as Robert had felt when he found out. But he didn't move. Not yet. This wasn't about anger. This was about winning. He had to know how deep this went. Robert exhaled slowly, his mind clearing. He pulled out his phone and started taking photos. Click. Emma's eyes locked onto Dan's, her lips curled in that soft, secretive smile she used to give him. Click. Dan rubbing the inside of her wrist with his thumb, his body language screaming intimacy. Click. The way they looked at each other, comfortable, safe, like they weren't hiding anything anymore. His breath was steady, controlled. Proof first, payback later. Dan signaled for the check, and Robert straightened in his seat, watching closely. Emma laughed at something he said. Dan slid an arm around her waist. Robert clenched his teeth as they walked out onto the sidewalk, stepping toward Emma's SUV. That SUV, the one he had bought her on their anniversary, and now she was driving another man home in it. Robert gripped the steering wheel so hard it creaked under his fingers. Of course, Dan had been drinking, so she was taking him home, like a wife would. They drove through the quiet streets, taking the familiar road toward Dan's apartment. Robert kept his distance, staying hidden in traffic. Emma pulled into the back lot of Dan's complex, parking in a shadowed space near the entrance. Robert eased his rental into a spot across the street, his heartbeat slow and steady. Then, they started talking. Robert leaned forward, his phone already connected to the voice recorder hidden in Emma's car. Then, he heard her voice. Emma sighed. "We need to talk about this, Dan." Dan exhaled heavily. "Emma, we have talked about it." "Not enough," she snapped, frustration lacing her voice. "I don't want to sneak around anymore. We need to move forward." Robert's jaw locked. "Move forward?" Dan hesitated. "Move forward how?" Emma let out a sharp breath. "We tell him the truth. We tell him it's over. What can he do? Nothing. He's a doormat, Dan. He didn't even notice anything for years." Robert saw red. His fingers curled so tight around the phone that for a second he thought he might crush it. A doormat? That's what she thought of him? Dan was silent for a moment before speaking, his voice lower. "And the girls?" Emma scoffed. "They love you. They see you as their real father. This won't change anything." Robert froze. His blood turned ice cold. Their real father? His stomach dropped so fast that for a moment he felt dizzy. Dan's voice wavered. "Emma, they don't know." "Not yet," she admitted. "But we'll tell them. I've been laying the groundwork for months. Stacy is practically begging for the divorce to be over, and Sophie, she'll come around." Robert was numb. "Laying the groundwork? For months?" Dan sighed. "And the house?" "I'll split it," Emma said simply. "He'll get his half, I'll take mine. He's barely there anyway. He'll move on." "He always does." Dan didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice shook slightly. "I don't know, Emma. He's going to kill me." For the first time, Robert actually smiled. Because yes, he could. He imagined it so clearly. yanking open the car door, dragging Dan out by his collar, smashing his skull against the pavement until he stopped moving, until he stopped breathing. He could already hear Emma screaming. He could already feel his daughter's eyes on him, horrified, shocked. And for a second, he almost didn't care, but he didn't move. Not yet. Because this wasn't about anger. This was about winning. Emma sighed, her voice softer now. Dan, we can stop hiding. I want this. I want us to be a family, a real family. Robert's stomach twisted. A real family. Like he had never been part of it. His daughters, the ones he had worked his ass off to provide for, had already replaced him. Emma had already decided, Dan had already decided, and they were just waiting for the right moment to tell him. Emma leaned toward Dan, kissing him softly, as if Robert wasn't sitting just a few feet away, watching his life crumble. Then she got back in the driver's seat and pulled out of the lot, heading home to his house. Dan disappeared into his apartment. Robert sat in the dark, gripping the wheel so tightly he felt his nails cut into his palm. They weren't afraid of him. They thought he was weak. They thought he'd just accept this and walk away. But they were wrong. He wasn't just going to divorce Emma. He wasn't just going to expose Dan. He was going to ruin them. At 2 p.m. sharp, Dan left his apartment. Robert followed. Just like before, Dan pulled into the high school parking lot. And just like before, his daughters got into his car. Like he was their real father, like Robert had already been erased. Then they went to the beauty salon. Emma was waiting. And when Dan stepped out, he didn't hesitate. He kissed her, right in front of the girls. And that's when Robert almost snapped. But instead, he pulled out his phone. Click. Dan picking up the girls. Click. Emma stepping into the car. Click. The kiss. His revenge was just beginning. A few days later, Robert sat across from Jonathan Reese, his financial advisor. You need to act fast, Jonathan said. North Carolina's an equitable distribution state. Emma's entitled to half unless we move things now. Robert exhaled slowly, his mind still tangled in what he had heard that night. His daughters, his girls, weren't really his, or was that just Emma's twisted way of making Dan feel more secure? His chest ached. He loved them, always had. But if they weren't his, what then? You still with me? Jonathan asked. Robert forced himself to focus. Yeah, what do I do? First, move assets, max out your retirement accounts, courts won't touch what's locked away, then the college funds. You said there's $200,000 total? Yeah, Jonathan smirked. Crypto. Robert frowned. Crypto? You move the funds into cold storage. No fixed value means it's harder to split. Legal, if done before filing. Robert exhaled. Their college money. Money he had saved for them. But if they weren't his, why should Emma be the one to control it? Do it. And the house? Refinance, Jonathan said. Pull out equity, load it with debt. When she fights for half, she gets half the burden. Robert's jaw tightened. Good. An hour later, Robert dropped a thick manila folder onto Ethan Mason's desk. His divorce attorney flipped through photos, transcripts, and proof of the affair. Ethan let out a low whistle. Damn, you weren't kidding. I want her to lose everything, Robert said. Ethan nodded. Adultery's still recognized in North Carolina. This could kill her alimony claim, but the kids? That's a battle. Robert's throat was tight. She's been turning them against me. I want full custody. Ethan leaned back. Courts push for joint custody, but if we prove parental alienation, like her laying the groundwork, we can argue she's unfit. Add the affair in front of the kids, and you've got leverage. Robert barely heard him. His mind was racing. He had held his daughters on their first day of school, taught them how to ride bikes, stayed up all night when they were sick, and now there was a chance they weren't his. But he wasn't ready for that truth. Not yet. His stomach turned. If they bring up DNA in court, Ethan exhaled, then we handle it. You don't have to push for it. If she tries to use it against you, we make her the villain. Courts don't like women who hide paternity. If she knew and kept it from you, she's in trouble. Robert clenched his jaw. That gave him time to figure out if he wanted the truth. Ethan studied him. You can prepare legally now, and when the time comes, you decide how far you want to take it. You don't have to make that choice today. Robert exhaled slowly. He wasn't ready. But when the time came, when they thought they had won, he'd be the one to make the final move. Robert sat in his rental car, parked in the dimly lit lot of a rundown motel. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly against the cracked pavement. The place reeked of cheap cigarettes and regret, the kind of place people came to when they had something to hide. For the past hour, he had been watching room 112. Dan's black Jeep Cherokee was parked outside. Robert had expected another secret rendezvous with Emma, but tonight something was different. At first, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open. A woman stepped out. Not Emma. She was in her mid to late 20s, tall, with long dark hair and a tight dress that hugged her frame. High heels clicked softly against the pavement as she pulled a leather jacket over her shoulders. She glanced around nervously before walking toward her car, her movements quick and purposeful. Robert felt a slow, dark realization settle in his gut. Dan was cheating on Emma. The hypocrisy, the audacity. Robert wasn't even sure why it made him so furious. But it did. Dan had stolen his wife, his family, his life. And yet, it still wasn't enough for him. He was using Emma just like he had used Robert their entire lives. Robert watched as the woman got into her car and pulled out of the lot. His mind was already racing. He had to know the truth. Without hesitation, he started the engine and followed. Robert tailed her carefully, keeping his distance. She wasn't heading home. Just a few blocks away, she pulled into a gas station. Perfect. She stepped out, walking toward the convenience store entrance. Now was his chance. Robert pulled up beside her car and got out. She noticed him immediately, her body language shifting. "What do you want?" she asked, crossing her arms. Suspicious, guarded, Robert kept his voice calm. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need some information." Her expression barely flickered. "About what?" "Dan Beckett." Her shoulders stiffened slightly, but she shook her head. "Don't know him." Robert exhaled and pulled a wad of $100 bills from his pocket, holding it up. 2,000 to talk, 5,000 for the truth. Her eyes flicked to the cash. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she sighed, stepping back toward her car. "Get in." Inside the car, she took the $2,000 and stuffed it into her purse. "All right, talk." "I'm Robert," he said, watching her closely. "Dan's brother." She stilled. "Brother?" "Stepbrother. We grew up together." She exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Okay, so what do you want?" "I want to know the truth," Robert said. "How often do you see him?" She hesitated. 3 times a month. Same motel, same routine." Robert's jaw tightened. "And what does he say?" She rolled her eyes. "He hates his life. Says he's trapped in a relationship he never wanted. That Emma manipulated him into staying." Robert's stomach turned. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "He doesn't even know if the kids are his." The air in the car shifted. Robert froze. "What?" She glanced at him, then at the cash. Robert pulled out another wad of bills. "I'll make it 5 grand." She hesitated, licking her lips. Then she said, "Emma gives him money." Robert stiffened. "What?" "He drinks a lot, and he gambles. Emma pays for him. He's basically a kept man." Robert's pulse pounded. The escort shifted, her voice quieter now. "Honestly, that money he gives me, it's probably yours." He even joked about it once, said his brother's wife funds his lifestyle. Something inside Robert snapped. Dan was gambling away money that Robert had worked for, money that was supposed to support his family, money that Emma was giving him. His hands shook with fury. Robert exhaled slowly. "You want out of this life?" She blinked, startled. "What? You have a kid, don't you?" Her face hardened. "How do you—" "I saw your phone screen." Robert nodded toward the console. A toddler's face had flashed across it when she checked a message. Her throat bobbed. "Yeah, so, what?" Robert pulled out another thick wad of bills. More than she had likely ever seen at once. 15 grand. You take it, you walk away from this life. Start fresh. She stared at the cash, her lip trembled slightly. "Why would you do that?" "Because I need your help." She swallowed hard. "With what?" "We set Dan up." She sucked in a breath. "Set him up how?" Robert smirked. "We make Emma catch him in the act." They drove to an ATM, and Robert handed her $5,000 in cash. "That's for now," he said. "You'll get the remaining $15,000 once the job is done." She nodded, gripping the cash like it was her lifeline. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Next time you meet Dan, get him talking. We need his confession. Use a hidden voice recorder." She nodded. "I can do that." "Second," Robert continued, "you text Emma from his phone, something that will bring her straight to the motel." The woman hesitated, but Robert held her gaze. "Think about your daughter," he said softly. "You want her to grow up with a mother who's trapped in this?" Her eyes watered. She swallowed hard, then nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." Robert pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. Wait for my call. I'll arrange everything. She took it, still looking stunned. Then she exhaled and whispered, Thank you. Robert gave her one last nod before stepping out of the car. As Robert sat in his car watching her drive away, he knew one thing for certain. Dan thought he was untouchable. Dan thought he had won. But he was about to find out just how wrong he was. The next afternoon, Robert parked a block away from Sophie's school, waiting. He shouldn't have been here. If things had gone the way they were supposed to, he would be offshore, standing on a steel platform in the middle of the ocean, keeping the rigs running, just like he had for years. But instead, he was here, watching the entrance of a high school, like a man who had lost everything, because in a way he had, his wife, his home, his daughters, and maybe even the truth about them. But Sophie, she was his last chance. The final piece that hadn't completely slipped through his fingers yet. If he lost her too, there would be nothing left worth saving. The bell rang. Students started spilling out onto the sidewalk in noisy clusters, laughing, talking, shoving each other playfully. Then he saw her. Sophie was walking alone, her head down, eyes locked on her phone as she made her way toward the parking lot. Robert pulled forward and rolled down the window. Sophie. She froze, mid-step. Her head snapped up, eyes widening at the sight of the car. At the sight of him. Dad? She whispered, stunned. Robert forced a small smile. Get in, kiddo. She hesitated. Her shoulders stiffened. Then, after a heartbeat, she climbed in, shutting the door carefully behind her. The second she sat down, her hands started shaking. She licked her lips, swallowing hard. Why are you here? You're supposed to be at work. Robert exhaled. He had expected this question. Sophie had always been the observant one. Stacy followed whatever suited her best. Sophie asked questions. And now she was starting to realize just how much she didn't know. I was supposed to be, Robert admitted. But something happened. She shifted uncomfortably, staring at her lap. Yeah, I figured. Robert clenched the steering wheel. Of course, she figured. She had known something was wrong for a while, but no one told him. He swallowed back the bitterness. I know about your mother and Dan. Sophie sucked in a sharp breath, her shoulders tensing. She didn't say anything, didn't look at him. She just stared at her hands, twisting her fingers together, her breathing shaky. You knew, didn't you? Robert asked softly. Sophie let out a choked sound. Then suddenly, she was crying, not soft, silent tears, not the careful, controlled sadness of someone who was trying to keep it together. This was full-body, gut-wrenching, shaking sobs. Robert's heart clenched. He reached for her, pulling her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her like he used to when she was little and had nightmares. I wanted to tell you, she sobbed, gripping his jacket like she was afraid he would disappear. I swear, Dad, I did. But it all happened so fast. And then Stacy... Shh, Robert whispered, holding her tighter. I know. It's okay. No, it's not, she cried, pulling back, her face wet with tears. I should have told you. I should have done something, but Mom kept saying you wouldn't understand. And then Stacy... She hiccuped, pressing her hands against her face. I just didn't know what to do, she whispered. I didn't want to hurt you. Robert swallowed hard, his throat tight. She was just a kid, caught in the middle of something she never should have been involved in. He wiped a tear from her cheek. It's not your fault, Sophie. She sniffled, hiccuping slightly. Then finally, she looked at him. But what now? She whispered. Robert exhaled. This was it, his chance to fix what he could. I need your help, he said carefully. Sophie frowned, wiping her face. With what? He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old burner phone. I need you to log into your mom's Instagram and Facebook on this phone, secretly, and then bring it back to me. She stared at him, her face paled slightly. Why? Robert hesitated. How much could he tell her? How much should he tell her? I can't explain everything yet, he admitted, but I promise you, this is important. Sophie bit her lip, looking down at the phone. Dad, she swallowed. If I do this, am I betraying Mom? Robert inhaled deeply. That was the hardest question yet. Sweetheart, he said gently, your mother has already betrayed me, and she's lied to you too. Sophie's lip trembled. I know, she whispered. I don't want to make things worse. Robert squeezed her hand. You're not making anything worse. You're just helping me fix things, and I promise you, when this is all over, he swallowed, I'm coming back, and I'm never leaving again. Sophie exhaled, then took the phone and tucked it into her bag. She nodded. Okay, I'll do it. Next day, Sophie slipped into his car again after school, handing him the phone. Her face was pale, her hands shaky. Here, it's done. Robert took the phone, staring at the login screen. You did good, kiddo, he said softly. Sophie hesitated, biting her lip. Dad, what are you going to do? Robert looked at her, really looked at her. I'm going to fix everything. And this time he meant it. Robert stood in the dimly lit motel room, the musty odor of stale cigarettes clinging to the worn carpet. He'd rented rooms 114 and 115 at this rundown spot on the outskirts of town, 114 for Dan and Marissa, 115 for himself. It was the culmination of months of careful planning, a meticulous trap that would expose Dan and Emma's affair publicly. On the cramped little table in room 115, Robert had laid out the tools of his plan. A small pinhole camera wired to an old phone, a thin coil of cable snaking through a vent into room 114, and his laptop, connected to Emma's Facebook and Instagram accounts. With a single click, Robert could begin live streaming the feed from the hidden camera, broadcasting their betrayals to everyone who followed Emma on social media. He remembered the advice of his lawyer, Ethan Mason. Collect everything you can. Don't just guess. Prove it. And so Robert had. He had photos, recorded calls, and confessions. But this final, raw, public confrontation would be the nail in the coffin. From inside room 115, Robert watched a grainy video feed on his laptop as Dan stepped into room 114, greeted by Marissa's careful smile. She was the escort Dan had secretly seen for months, a woman now working with Robert to set him up in return for enough cash to escape her old life. Hey, baby, she said to Dan, letting her hand drift over his shoulder. Dan dropped a faded duffel bag on the bed. His eyes flicked around, uneasy. Marissa coaxed him to sit, placing a hand on his knee. Rough day? She asked softly. Dan let out a sharp exhale, raking his fingers through his hair. Emma's up my ass about going official. She wants me to, I don't know, face Robert or something. She thinks if she can push him over the edge, she'll get everything in the divorce. He rubbed at his forehead. But none of this is going the way I wanted. Marissa slid closer. What did you want, Dan? He gave a bitter laugh. Hell if I know. I needed money. My gambling's gotten worse, he admitted, casting a guilty glance at her. I owe a lot. Bookies, loan shark. Emma's been covering for me, using Robert's money. A sneer twisted his mouth. Can't say I feel bad about it. Robert's always had everything handed to him. Big job, nice house. Now he's basically paying off my debts. Robert's jaw tensed behind the wall in room 115. He'd known Dan had lost money, but hearing the casual way Dan admitted he was funneling Robert's hard-earned income into his gambling debts filled him with fury. But you love Emma, right? Marissa ventured, her tone feigning curiosity. Love? Dan snorted. She was lonely and she had the money. I never planned on playing daddy to her kids, especially since, well, he trailed off. Marissa tilted her head. Since what? Dan looked pensive for a moment. I'm not sure those girls are even Robert's. Emma keeps hinting it might be me. We messed around years ago, right after she got married. He stopped, shaking his head. Doesn't matter. If they're mine, they're mine. But Emma's been using that to keep me around, pay my gambling debts. I'm stuck. Robert's vision blurred at the edges. So it was true. They'd been messing around even longer than he suspected, and now there was a question of paternity for his daughters. Marissa's eyes widened. You never got tested? To see if you're the father? Dan shrugged, a mix of arrogance and genuine shame. It's not exactly something we can do without Robert noticing. Plus, Emma said she wasn't sure. Maybe it's best we don't know. Marissa let out a theatrical, sympathetic sigh, playing the part. That's a lot to handle. No wonder you gamble. Dan smirked humorlessly. Yeah, well, I've always been a risk-taker. It's just... No one told me the biggest risk would be Robert losing his mind and taking us all down. Marissa saw Dan's phone lying on the nightstand. Her cue. She slipped her hand over his shoulder, distracting him with a suggestive touch, while her other hand deftly picked up his phone. She'd memorized Dan's code from previous visits, and he was too keyed up to notice. In a few quick taps, she typed a text to Emma. Emma, come quick, emergency. Motel 114. Don't call. Phone is messed up. Hurry. She hit send, then flicked on airplane mode, locking the phone in a forced loop so Emma couldn't call back to confirm. Perfect. Emma would rush here, frantic to see what was wrong, and find Dan in bed with an escort. Robert's heart pounded. Now it was time to go live. He hovered over the Start Live video button on Emma's social accounts, labeled with the cryptic post, "I have something to confess, live now." He clicked it. The shaky feed from the hidden camera lit the screen, broadcasting Dan and Marissa to Emma's entire friends list. But the plan hit a snag when Robert tried to call Marissa's burner phone. No signal. She was supposed to excuse herself and slip out, meeting Robert outside. Instead, she peeked at the phone's dark screen, biting her lip. "Be right back," she told Dan, stepping into the bathroom and shutting the door. Footsteps pounded outside. Emma's voice rang through the corridor. "Dan, what's going on? Open up." Dan's head snapped up, panic flashing in his eyes. "Crap. Emma's here. Stay in the bathroom," he hissed to Marissa. "I'll handle her." He opened the door just a crack. The moment Emma saw him, she shoved the door wide, nearly knocking him aside. Her face was red, her eyes darting around the shabby motel room. "Dan, I got your text. Emergency? Then your phone wouldn't pick up?" Her voice rose with mounting fear and anger. "What the hell is going on?" Marissa peered out of the bathroom, dress strap fallen off her shoulder. Emma's gaze locked onto the other woman, taking in her disheveled hair and rumpled clothing. "You," Emma whispered, her tone dripping with betrayal. "You're with her?" Dan raised his hands defensively. "Emma, wait, I didn't send you any text." But Emma's fury erupted. She lunged at Marissa, grabbing a fistful of her hair. "You trashy what?" Emma screamed, yanking hard. Marissa cried out in pain and reflexively slapped Emma across the cheek, trying to break free. Emma snarled, pulling harder. They staggered into the dresser, knocking a lamp to the floor with a crash. On Robert's screen, the live stream shook as the two women attacked each other. Comments poured in, viewers tagging friends in shock, some calling Emma's name in disbelief, others screaming for someone to call the police. Dan rushed in, grabbing Emma around the waist, forcing her back. Marissa stumbled, tears in her eyes, holding the side of her head where Emma had torn out a small chunk of hair. "Get off me!" Emma screeched at Dan, then pointed at Marissa. "I gave up everything for you, and you're with this prostitute?" Marissa shot back. "Don't talk to me about giving up anything! You've been lying to your husband for years!" Emma's lips curled in a snarl. "Shut your mouth! You don't know the first thing about Robert. He was never around. He chose those stupid oil rigs over me and the girls. He's gone half our lives." Marissa, trembling, spat. "So you replace him with a gambling leech who's cheating on you too?" All the while, Robert's rage simmered in room 115. He slammed his laptop shut. The feed continued streaming from the pinned phone in room 114 and stepped out into the breezeway. The shouting guided him straight to the battered door of room 114. He pushed it open without warning. Emma, Dan, and Marissa all froze at the sight of him. Emma's hair was wild, her cheek bright red from Marissa's slap. Marissa's eyes glistened, pain etched on her face. Dan stood between them, chest heaving, fists clenched at his sides. Emma's face went ashen. Robert, she stammered, stumbling back a step. "Oh, God, I can explain, Robert's voice trembled with fury. "Explain what? That you're here with him? Or that you just tried to rip out someone's hair?" Emma looked ready to collapse. "Robert, please. I was lonely. You left me alone for weeks at a time. You never cared about my feelings, about the kids. We needed you, and you just disappeared offshore." Robert's heart clenched. Old guilt tangled with betrayal. "I worked to give you and the girls a better life. Everything you needed. But you used that money for Dan's gambling debts? You let him have free reign in my own home?" Dan glared, though he took a step back. "Emma pays me, sure, but it's your fault, man. You left the door wide open. You were gone so much, it was easy." Robert clenched his fists, forcing himself not to lash out. "Easy to do what? Ruin my marriage? Drain my bank account? Twist my daughter's minds against me?" Emma burst into tears, pressing a hand to her mouth. I'm so sorry, Robert. I didn't plan for it to go this far. I was just lonely, and Dan was around, and..." She swallowed hard. "But don't act like you're blameless. You were never there. You were more married to your job than to me." Marissa inched backward, eyeing the door. She wanted out, but the conversation had taken a darker turn. Emma seemed to realize the entire truth was spilling out. She looked at Robert, then at Dan, tears streaking her face. "There's more," Emma choked, voice shaking. "Robert, I'm not sure the girls are yours. Robert's jaw tightened. He'd harbored suspicions for a while. Emma had hinted as much, though never so plainly. Still, hearing her finally say it out loud made his stomach churn. Emma's sobs intensified. Dan and we messed around a long time ago, right after the wedding. Then I got pregnant. I never knew for sure if they were yours or his. She glanced at Dan with pure misery. If they're Dan's, I thought it was fate. He had no one, and I was so lonely. Dan's eyes flared as realization struck him. You never told me there was a real chance I'm their father? You always said you weren't sure. Emma let out a ragged sob. I'm still not sure. Sometimes they look like you, sometimes like Robert. I couldn't face it. I kept waiting for the right moment. Robert exhaled shakily. He'd suspected this for months, but the open confirmation felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Every day he'd spent offshore, every sacrifice he'd made to give the girls a secure future, now hovered under a dark cloud of uncertainty. You told me you'd handle it, Dan snapped at Emma, voice trembling. You swore you'd keep Robert in the dark so you wouldn't lose the house and the money. I never asked to be a damn father. Emma whipped her head around to him, desperation in her eyes. You needed me to cover your gambling debts, Dan. I needed someone to be here when Robert wasn't. We both agreed we'd figure it out later. Robert's throat constricted. He forced himself to speak, voice raw. Stop, he barked, anger and hurt distorting each syllable. That's enough. I've heard what I need to. He steadied himself, refusing to show more shock than he already had. He'd get the truth, even if a DNA test was the only way to finally confirm everything. Robert pulled out 2 small stacks of legal documents, his hands shaking with rage. He held the first out to Emma. Emma Williams, he said, voice cracking. I'm serving you with divorce papers for adultery, marital misconduct, and parental alienation. I have proof of your affair, of your spending, and now this, the possibility you hid the kid's true paternity. Emma let out a wail that rattled the walls. She reached for the papers, nearly dropping them as her body trembled. Robert, no, please. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know what to do. She slid to her knees, clutching the documents, her face a mess of tears, mascara streaking her cheeks. Robert turned to Dan, the second stack of papers in hand. Dan Beckett, I'm suing you for alienation of affection. I've got it all on tape. Your confessions about gambling, your involvement in turning my daughters against me, your ongoing affair with Emma. He shoved the papers at Dan's chest. Dan grabbed them reflexively, fury and fear mingling in his eyes. You can't be serious. You think a judge is going to make me pay for some messed up marriage? Robert laughed, a harsh, broken sound. You've gambled your way into thousands of dollars of debt. Debt paid with my money. You helped destroy my family, and we're in North Carolina, where alienation of affection still stands. So yes, Dan, I'm perfectly serious. Emma sobbed, burying her face in her hands. My life is over, she choked out. Everyone's watching. Robert, please, the live stream. Robert pointed to the phone discreetly attached near the ceiling vent. It's live, Emma. Your entire friend list has seen you attacking Marissa, confessing about Dan, the kids, everything. Emma gasped, doubling over as though she'd been punched. No. My mother, my friends, the girls, they'll see. Her sobs turned into ragged screams, tears hitting the filthy carpet. You've ruined me, Robert. He stared at her in disbelief, the bitterness flooding his chest. Ruined you? You've lied to me for years, stolen my money, possibly stolen my children. You attacked this woman. He gestured at Marissa, who still stood aside, nursing her scalp. I'm only showing everyone the truth. Emma suddenly whirled, spitting fury again at Marissa. You set us up, you piece of trash. Marissa, eyes wet, snapped back. Don't you dare touch me again. You already ripped out half my hair. She lifted her purse, ready to swing if Emma lunged. Dan stepped between them, arm up. Enough. This is insane. Emma, I told you this would blow up in our faces. Robert's not stupid. He was always the smart one. Robert inhaled shakily, reining in his rage. Marissa, you're free to go, he said gently, stepping aside. She edged toward the door. Even in her fear, she managed a grateful look at Robert. He discreetly pressed an extra roll of bills into her hand. 2,000 more than promised. For the trouble, he muttered. I didn't expect Emma to get so violent. Marissa nodded, eyes shining with relief and pain. Thank you, and good luck. She slipped out the door, leaving Emma on her knees, Dan standing there in a daze, and Robert at the threshold, still trembling with anger and heartbreak. Emma raised her tear-stained face to Robert. "What about the girls?" she whispered. "They might be yours. I I don't know. Don't tear them away from me." Robert's voice cracked. "I'll get a DNA test. If they're mine, I'll fight for them. If they're Dan's," he glared at Dan, who swallowed hard, "then you two can figure it out." Emma covered her face with her hands, another sob ripping through her. "Robert, please, I'm sorry." A painful silence followed. Finally, Robert turned toward the door. "I have nothing left to say. My lawyer and the courts can handle the rest." He shut off the live stream from his phone with a tap. The damage was already done. Emma let out a strangled scream behind him, and Dan cursed under his breath. Their world had collapsed. Robert stepped outside into the warm night air, the neon vacancy sign humming overhead. He leaned against the chipped railing, breathing hard. His entire body shook, not just from anger, but from heartbreak. Emma's sobs echoed through the door. The marriage was over, but the weight of that truth pressed down on him like an anvil. A familiar figure stood near a sedan in the parking lot. Ethan Mason, Robert's divorce attorney. He lifted a hand in greeting, concern etched on his face. "That sounded intense." Ethan's voice was low. "You all right?" Robert nodded stiffly, though he felt anything but fine. They confessed everything. Dan's gambling, Emma's lies about the kids, the affair. It's all on camera, and it was streamed to Emma's social media. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath. "That's going to be a legal bomb. You want me to move forward with the custody motions? The paternity test?" Robert closed his eyes, grief twisting his gut. "Yes, we test to see if Sophie and Stacy are mine. If they are, I want full custody. If not," his voice faltered, "God, I've raised them as mine. I'm not sure how I'll handle it. But I can't let Emma and Dan keep lying." Ethan's gaze softened. "We'll get through this. You did what you had to do." Across the lot, Marissa was sliding into an old sedan she'd bought with the money Robert provided. She paused, catching his eye. Her hair was still a mess where Emma had yanked it, and there were faint bruises blooming on her arm. "I'm sorry it got this ugly," Robert said quietly, walking over. "I never expected Emma to be so violent." Marissa forced a half smile. "I've seen worse, but yeah, I'm just glad I'm done." Her voice cracked. "Thank you for giving me a way out. I'll testify if you need me to. I'm sorry for your family." Robert's eyes burned. "Thanks. Take care, Marissa." She nodded, started the engine, and pulled away. Robert sat in his motel room, watching his phone light up with another call, then another, and another. The fallout was worse than he had expected. Emma's betrayal had spread through their community like wildfire. Friends, family, coworkers, everyone had seen the live stream, and now everyone had an opinion. His lawyer, Ethan Mason, had warned him that things would get ugly, but he hadn't been prepared for journalists offering money for his story. He shut them all down immediately. This wasn't entertainment, it was his life. The worst part was his daughters. Sophie. "Dad, please answer me. I don't know what to do." Stacy. "I can't believe you did this. You ruined everything." Robert exhaled. Stacy had always been emotional, easily influenced. She saw things in black and white, and right now he was the villain in her story. But Sophie, she was different. She wanted to understand. And then there was the matter of the DNA test. 2 days later, Robert met with Ethan in his office. Divorce proceedings had already begun, but Robert needed more than just a legal split. "I want a DNA test," Robert said, voice tight. Ethan sighed. "You're sure about this?" Robert hesitated. "No, but I need to know." The test results came back 3 days later. Neither Sophie nor Stacy were his. The words on the report blurred as Robert read them over and over, hoping he had misread something. But there was no mistake. He wasn't their father. Not biologically, at least. He had raised them, loved them, spent his life working to give them everything they needed. And it had all been built on a lie. He had expected anger, fury, but all he felt was hollow. "Robert," Ethan's voice was cautious. "What does this mean legally?" Robert asked, his throat dry. Ethan sat forward. "It doesn't change custody unless you want it to. You're still their legal father. If you want to fight for them, you can." He paused. "Or, if you want to walk away—" "No," Robert's voice was steel. "I am not walking away." A DNA test didn't erase 18 years of being their father. With the affair and paternity deception exposed, the court had no sympathy for Emma. Divorce and asset division, Robert won everything. The judge took into account the overwhelming proof of Emma's infidelity, financial deception, and emotional manipulation. She had not only committed adultery, but also knowingly misled Robert about the children's paternity. As a result, no alimony. Emma wasn't entitled to a cent, no share of assets. The house, savings, and vehicles all went to Robert. She had to move out. With no money and no place to go, she was forced to move in with her mother. It was a humiliating downfall for someone who had spent years living comfortably off Robert's hard work. Alienation of affection lawsuit against Dan. Robert's lawsuit against Dan was airtight. With the recordings, financial records, and Dan's own confessions on the live stream, the court ruled in Robert's favor. Dan was ordered to pay $250,000 in damages, money he didn't have. He was drowning in gambling debts, and now he owed Robert more than he could ever repay. His life crumbled. Custody battle and the final decision. Despite the DNA test, Robert fought for custody. Emma tried to hold on to both girls, using emotional manipulation to turn them against him. Stacy fell for it. She refused to speak to Robert, blaming him for exposing the affair so publicly. "I don't care what she did," she said. "You destroyed our family." It crushed Robert, but he let her go. She made her choice. Sophie, however, was different. She came to him in tears. "Dad," she whispered, "I don't care what the DNA says. You're my dad." Robert's chest tightened. He had lost so much. But not her. Sophie chose to live with him. The court granted Robert full custody of Sophie, while Stacy, now 18, decided to stay with her mother. To celebrate, Robert bought Sophie a new car, a deep blue BMW, her favorite color. She cried when she saw it. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "You do," Robert said firmly. "You're still my daughter." With no money, no house, and no legal leverage, Emma was left with nothing. She moved in with her mother, who had known about the affair and kept it a secret. People who once considered Emma a friend cut her off. She had destroyed her own reputation. She texted out to Robert once, weeks after the divorce was finalized. "Can we talk? Just once?" Robert never responded. She had taken everything from him. His trust, his family, his peace of mind. He owed her nothing. Dan didn't fare any better. With his gambling debts, the $250,000 judgment, and no job prospects, he was ruined. Robert got a text from an unknown number one night. "You ruined my life. I hope you're happy." Robert stared at the message before deleting it. Dan had done this to himself. Months passed. Robert sold the house, moving into a smaller, more modest home. It wasn't about luxury anymore. It was about peace. It was just him and Sophie now. One night, as they sat outside by the fire pit, she spoke softly. "Do you regret it? Finding out the truth?" Robert stared at the flames before answering. "No," he said finally, "because the truth sets you free." Sophie nodded. "And Stacy?" "She'll come around," Robert said, though he wasn't sure. But he hoped. They sat in silence for a while. Then Sophie smiled. "Thanks for the car, Dad," he chuckled. "Don't crash it." "I won't," she promised. Then, after a beat, "Love you, Dad." His throat tightened, but he smiled. "Love you too, kiddo." And in that moment, he realized he had lost so much, but he hadn't lost everything. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.